Bienvenue dans cette 12e session du séminaire de la FISIER qui s'intitule La littérature philosophique de la République des deux nations polono-lituaniennes au début de l'époque moderne. C'est une session qui avait été souhaitée par la FISIER il y a quelques années lors de l'adhésion du centre de Cracovie et de la revue Terminus à notre fédération. Elle est entièrement redevable à Grażyna Urban-Gotziek que je tiens à en remercier vivement au nom du CA. Nous nous réjouissons de voir que cette session accueille un public nouveau et nous espérons bien sûr que ce n'est que le début d'autres échanges fructueux entre centres travaillant sur la Renaissance. Et je le rappelle pour les têtes nouvelles, la FISIER rassemble des sociétés, centres et instituts travaillant sur la Renaissance. Elle se veut fédéraliste, internationale, transdisciplinaire et plurilingue. En général, les sessions sont organisées par plusieurs sociétés membres et se font en deux langues, le français et l'anglais, parfois une troisième langue. Tous les membres des sociétés membres peuvent y assister. La session d'aujourd'hui est un peu exceptionnelle puisqu'elle prend la forme d'une rencontre en hybride à Cracovie et en virtuel en anglais. Elle est l'occasion d'une rencontre, d'une meilleure connaissance mutuelle, nous l'espérons, et pourrait être le point de départ d'autres formes de travaux collectifs. Je vais donc laisser la parole à Grażyna Urban-Gotziek qui a tout fait en la remerciant encore.
Hello to all and welcome to this 12th session of the International Seminar of the FISIER, the Philosophical Literature of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the Early Modern Period. The session was planned by the FISIER a few years ago when the Krakow Center and the journal Terminus joined our federation. The session is taking place entirely through the efforts of Grażyna Urban-Gotziek, to whom I wish to extend the most sincere thanks on behalf of the Governing Council of the FISIER. We are happy to see that this session will welcome a new public and hope that this is only the start of other fruitful exchanges between centers working on the Renaissance. The FISIER links societies, centers, and institutes whose research centers on the Renaissance. It is federalist, international, transdisciplinary, and multilingual. In general, the sessions of our seminar series are organized by several member societies and take place in two languages, French and English, and sometimes a third language. All individuals and member societies can attend the sessions. Today's session is a little exceptional. It has taken a hybrid form in presence in Krakow and virtually the sole language being English. It is a first occasion to further our contacts and exchanges, and we hope it will be the point of departure for other collaborative projects. I now invite Grażyna Urban-Gotziek to proceed and thank her again.
Merci beaucoup, Pascal. Thank you very much, Ulrich. Yes, in the beginning, I would like to thank you for inviting Terminus Journal and Renaissance Literature Lab to organize this session and for accepting my proposed modification to the ordinary scan of Federation meetings. Thanks to them, we can enjoy this wonderful audience both here in Krakow and in the virtual space. This also enabled us to present new research on the philosophical and political thoughts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the research based on the new findings made within the project Polonica Philosophica Orientalia, focused on researching philosophical manuscripts kept in Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Belarus libraries. The value of this research is all the greater as many of these libraries has been inaccessible for centuries and due to the present war became unavailable again, and the books stored there are in great danger. The international research group created for this project has seized a historical opportunity, this brief gap, to discover and save part of our lost heritage. Let me therefore introduce the first speaker and the head of the mentioned project, Professor Stefan Huber. Stefan Huber studied philosophy at the University of Vienna and holds his PhD and habilitation from the Jagiellonian University. Stefan is the director of the Department of Polish Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy, Jagiellonian University in Krakow. His scholarly interests are Polish and East European philosophy of the early modern period, especially political thought and metaphysics. His latest publication from the last 2 years are The Philosopher's Refusal of Action, Andreas Fritius Modrelius, Une pensée réagir à la Renaissance, edited by Philippe Bézin and Véronique Ferrer, Genève France, and Wspólnota Zysków i Strat, Societas jako nukleus wspólnoty politycznej u Aarona Aleksandra Olizarowskiego, The Community of Gains and Losses, Societas as the nucleus of the political community in Olizarowski's works, in the journal Odrodzenie i Reformacja w Polsce, and Natural Law in Polish and Lithuanian Sources, a comparative perspective in early modern natural law in East Central Europe, edited by Gabor Gango in Brill. Within the mentioned project, Polonica Philosophica Orientalia, a project funded by the National Humanities Development Programme, the two newest publications were produced under Professor Huber's direction and appeared just in 2023. There are team editions of Sigismundus Laus Min, De Jure et Justitia, I can show it here, and Anonymous Ingolstadtiensis Logica, together with Jacobus Ortiz in Introductionem Porphyry. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this meeting. I think it's very interesting to discuss our problems of research we have actually now, with the sources we are working on, trying to integrate them and to create some context in which we want to understand them. And it's very valuable for me to have this opportunity to present this work. It's still work in progress, so a part has been finished, as you mentioned, but it's still in progress, and the main part of our sources will appear this year, later this year. So it's a great opportunity to discuss this today. I will talk about the rule of law in the philosophical discourse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And when I wrote the abstract a year ago, I was more focused on clearly philosophical literature. In the meantime, I had a closer look at some legal texts. It was fascinating how closely they go with this kind of philosophical literature we are usually reading. So I will be focusing a bit on these legal texts too. Well, in Poland and Lithuania, the Renaissance is commonly called the Golden Age, and quite rightly so, as it brought about the beautiful cities of Krakow, Vilnius, Lviv, Rodna, and Zamość. Renaissance marks the beginning of university teaching and the literary languages of the Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Renaissance was also the golden age of political thought, which leads us to names like Marsilio of Padua and Wilhelm Ockham, Machiavelli, Pontarini, Baudin, and first and foremost, Erasmus of Rotterdam and Philip Melanchthon. They all played their roles in the Polish and Lithuanian discourse. Yet in this region, the philosophical thought on the state and the law developed in a rhythm of its own. This was due to the following conditions. First, in our region, the Renaissance was not a rebirth of an ancient culture after the Middle Ages. Unlike the Balkans and the Black Sea region, the northern part of Eastern Europe did not participate in ancient culture. Neither did it implement all elements of medieval culture once the states, among them the Kingdom of Poland, were founded around the year 1000. Second, as early as in the late 14th century, the multi-confessional and multicultural characteristics of Poland and Lithuania forced political philosophers and law theorists to reflect on practical paradigms, which, from an exclusively Western perspective, seem to be surprisingly modern and enlightened. Critical distance toward religious doctrines, religious, or as we would call it today, ideological neutrality of the state, individualism, naturalism, power division, and rule of law. Third, the Renaissance did not end in the 15th or 16th century. In political philosophy and jurisprudence, its central paradigms lasted until the middle of the 18th century. Thus, the 17th century is both Renaissance and early modern, both ahead of time and behind its time. Fourth, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Renaissance heritage became an important field of scientific research. At the same time, it disappeared from the popular historiography of Poland. Dramatic experiences between, symbolically speaking, 1771 and 1989 divisions, uprisings, externally imposed social reforms, political repressions, genocides, and isolation became the core of a new nation-building process. From this perspective, the Renaissance appears to be a prehistorical rather than a historical legacy. On the one hand, the Renaissance describes an essential part of the genetic code of Polish political and by far not only political culture. On the other hand, it dwells in a distant and incomprehensible past. As a result, Poland is much more influenced by the Renaissance than it admits. However, we should not forget that the situation is different in Lithuania, where the codification of law in the 16th century and other achievements of the Renaissance is vividly remembered as the root of today's constitutionalism. Thus, in trying to understand the characteristics of Polish and Lithuanian political philosophy, we should focus on local social structures, political practice, and historical chronology rather than on the gold standard of Western thought. Poland and Lithuania have neither been ahead of nor behind the West. They followed their own rhythm. As we saw, due to the specific chronology, the Polish academic tradition got into contact with early humanist, nominalist, and pre-Reformist schools without being preformed or prejudiced by medieval scholasticism. The first generations of learned men around 1400 were attracted by the conciliarism as taught at the University of Paris, Padua School of Roman Law, Marsilio of Padua, Wilhelm Ockham, and especially Johannes Buridanus. Scholarly works from the 15th century are mostly of nominalistic orientation and influenced by Renaissance humanism. It was only in the late 15th century that realist metaphysics appeared in the academic practice. Yet, bound rather to Albertus Magnus than Thomas Aquinas, this new via antiqua easily joined the old via moderna, forming the unique via communis Krakowiensis. The situation in Lithuania was similar. In 1577, the Jesuits founded the University of Vilnius on the basis of Renaissance and pre-early modern thought, which came directly from the schools of Salamanca and Coimbra. Spanish lawyers dominated the legal discourse. Aquinas remained a very formal authority and was regularly replaced by more liberal Suarez and contrary theorists such as Lessius and Lugo. Although the works of Erasmus were officially banned, his spirit was well represented in the Christian Ciceronianism taught by the Jesuits. This naissance, rather than renaissance, rooted Polish and Lithuanian philosophy in nominalist and Scotist traditions, far from realist metaphysics, in a reformist approach to ethics, economics, and politics. Finally, in a very practical attitude and an eclectic method. This, in general, was in line with the development towards the unique republican constitution of the Commonwealth of the two nations. The intellectual institutions, first and foremost, the universities of Krakow and Vilnius, including the network of Jesuit colleges, the royal court of Krakow and the ducal court of Vilnius, but also the numerous local centres of cultural life created by the nobility, the Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox and Union clergy, and last but not least, the organizations of ethnical and religious minorities. Followed a wide range of traditions and often fought with each other. Sometimes they reached the edge of civil war. and during the catastrophic events of the middle of the 17th century and the early 18th century went beyond this limit. However, the overwhelming majority accepted the Republican Constitution and interpreted it through models related to the Renaissance. In doing so, they needed to answer to questions that were specific for Poland and Lithuania. First, what kind of a state is a republic with a monarch? Is this a republic or rather a monarchy? Can it be called a state in the same sense in which the word is used for France or the church state? Second, what kind of state is a kingdom related to a duchy by a personal and or real union? Is this union a new state? If so, are the kingdom and the duchy states? Are there 3, 2, or 1 state? Third, can other political entities become states and participate in the union? And fourth, can political entities leave the union? Most philosophers interested in politics, beyond all differences between them, answered these questions in a similar manner. A republic with a monarch is a republic with a monarch. It is as simple as this, and to Polish and Lithuanian citizens, it will even seem strange to make a question out of this. From the point of view of a philosophy based on Aristotle and especially Polybius, a republic with a monarch is rather a republic than a monarchy. Republic is the more general term and monarchy is the more specific term. And this is rooted not only in formal nomenclature of forms of government, not in an observation of political practice. Politics is what concerns the politeia, the polis, civitas, and the politai, cives, citizens. In a republic with a monarch, the monarch is the first citizen, polites, civis. He's a special part of the republic, but a part only. Of course, in some regards, he differs from the rest of citizens. For example, when he calls a session of parliament or presides over it or uses others of his prerogatives. But in doing so, he even more proves to be a part of the republic, as all these competences are defined by the law and surveyed by the citizens. In the Polish-Lithuanian context, we should not call this republic a state. The republic is the law-based community of citizens, as we read in Cicero, while the state is basically the land owned by someone and therefore subject to his power, dominium. So we have to make a difference. On the one hand, the politeia, res publica, vivere civile, vivere libero, as Machiavelli says, and in Polish, the rzecz pospolita, res publica, rzecz pospolita. On the other hand, the Latin status, lo Stato, l'État, the state, in Polish, państwo, in Lithuanian, właściwe, dzierżawa, gospodarstwo, and the like. It is important to note that this difference is difficult to grasp in many languages. For example, the Ruthenian languages, as well as modern Lithuanian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian, use the loan word from Old Polish and, at the same time, Old Ruthenian, Rzecz Pospolita. English uses the term Commonwealth, adding the Polish-Lithuanian Rzecz Pospolita to a very short list of political entities bearing this name. The Rzecz Pospolita is a union of political entities, which in themselves are Rzeczy Pospolite, res publicae, commonwealths. The union has only those powers which the entities agree to delegate, formally or informally, openly or silently, voluntarily or by force. There were many conflicts between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as the two nominal nations of the Commonwealth of two nations, and it was possible to resolve them until the Rzeczpospolita was destroyed from the outside at the end of the 18th century. Conflicts with other internal republics, especially the Cossack entities in the mid-17th century could not be resolved and led to wars and separation. Other political entities can be associated with this union in at least three ways. First, by becoming one of the formal nations of the Commonwealth of N nations, where N is an open number. This was the approach of the Ruthenians in the Kiev region, and it failed. However, Petro Mochyla's efforts to reach an agreement with the Poles marks the beginning of one of the most important intellectual centers of Eastern Europe, the Kiev-Mohylian Academy. Second, by entering into a union with the Commonwealth of two nations. This was the case of Livonia, part of modern Latvia and Estonia, at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. And third, by entering into a union with one of the two nations. For example, the Duchy of Prussia became associated with the Kingdom of Poland, but not with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, or the Commonwealth of the two nations as a whole. And finally, no union likes its parts to leave. There was no formal procedure in the Commonwealth of the two nations in this concern. To sum up, the Rzeczpospolita is a Commonwealth, Respublika, and not a state, status. Because first, it is a form of government based on the people, which may well include a monarch. And second, it is a union of political entities based on partly different forms of government and a certain degree of autonomy. A pivotal aspect of this republican model was the idea that the law was above everyone, including the monarch. The monarch is neither the source of law, nor is he above the law. The law is above all citizens, and no citizen is above the law. This raises further questions. First, what is the source of law? Then, what is its content? Which of the various legal traditions should be the leading law? Who is entitled to apply, interpret, maintain, organize, renew, and codify the law? Should the law be codified at all? And finally, what is law? Based on the consensus above described, philosophers in the Republic of Poland, Lithuania, Prussia, and so on gave different answers to these questions. Codification of law became a systematic project in the Kingdom of Poland at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. In the 1490s, the Chancellor Johannes Laski founded a think tank to work on a statute, which eventually was published in 1506. Its first part contained formal law, the second a collection of German law and a number of theoretical commentaries. Laski's statute was closely related to the change in the form of government that took place right after 1500. In 1501, King Alexander edited the privilege of Melnik, in which he transferred power to the Senate. The king was now the princeps senatus, deprived of the right to appoint senators and governors of the provinces. The aristocracy was entitled to resist the king if he did not comply with the Senate. The privilege of Melnik was the project of an aristocratic monarchy in which the nobility had no decisive voice. Only 4 years later, in 1505, the form of government changed into a noble republic with a king. The Sejm became a bicameral parliament, and the lower house became the proper playground of politics. Although the king, the aristocracy, gathered in the Senate, and the nobility gathered in the lower house, together formed the Sejm in a formal sense, the lower house was now identified with the Sejm as such. This fundamental change is symbolized by the words contained in the parliamentary decision of 1505. Nihil novi constitui debeat, and so on. Nothing new should be constituted without our consent. Although there has been a number of intellectual solid codification projects in the following decades, there was no further progress in this field. The nobility understood the nihil novi of 1505, not only as the right to be asked for assents, but also as the right not to change anything in their customary law. Therefore, the ReNoV became a double symbol of, first, novel democracy, civic rights, and the parliamentary culture that was truly impressive at the backdrop of Europe, and second, of legal and cultural conservatism and the denial of codification of legal reform. This, however, was the case of the Kingdom of Poland. The Lithuanians published in 1529 the first Lithuanian statute, in 1566 the second one, and in 1588 the third one. This series of groundbreaking codifications is closely related to Lithuania's intellectual history, namely the history of political philosophy. Like the Statute of Lasky, the Lithuanian statutes gathered customary law, privileges added by the Grand Duke, judgments of courts, and earlier compilations of law. But the Lithuanians integrated significantly more material from foreign law, especially from Roman law, which was considered by philosophers as the best possible material because it is based on abstract principles. In this context, it's interesting to take a look at political mythology. Polish nobility developed the idea that it was genetically independent of any other nation because it stemmed from a mythical Sarmatian nation dwelling far in the east. Those ancestors were famous for their virtue, and the customary law had preserved that virtue. Therefore, any change, especially if induced from outside, would destroy the law and the republic. In Lithuania, the myth of the Roman descendants of the whole nation became an important political factor. Thus, the reception of Roman law could be presented as a step back to the roots. And there's a second important difference between the two confederated nations. The Poles defended the oral character of their customary law, while the Lithuanians embraced the idea of written law. The first statute of 1529 allowed judges to follow rules of customary law only in the absence of a written rule, under the condition that the relevant rule of customary law be immediately submitted to the parliament and written into the next edition of the Lithuanian statute. The structure of the statutes remained similar over the 16th century. The first statute was divided into 14 chapters and 368 articles concerning the presumption of innocence, the defense of the country as a matter for the state as a whole and for the noble society, the rights and freedoms of the nobility, property and inheritance, the functioning of the courts, punishment for violence, theft, and murder. Lithuanian historians view the statutes as the basis of their stated and tradition of law. For example, Vaidotas Vaičaitis anchors in them the leading values of Western political culture: rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Rule of law, according to Vaičaitis, is rooted in the principle of written law. Specifically, in the second Lithuanian statute, quotation, it was established for the first time that alongside the sovereignty of the sovereign of the country, there is the sovereignty of the civic nation, which is expressed in the institution of the same. End of quotation. The two sovereignties are in mutual competition. Sorry. So the two, sorry. Okay, the two sovereignties are in mutual competition. Judicial power tended to become independent of legislative and executive power, although the class of legal professionals was not being rated as separated from the executive. But the court system took now the decisive steps in its development. A system of 3 courts of first instance at the county level was established. Formally, They were available to everyone, not only to those who used to be citizens, but also the inhabitants who now step by step were approaching this status. So this was, of course, in a way, it was a dream rather than reality, but dreams are also a part of reality. It was prohibited to combine administrative and judicial offices. The Roman principle, nemo iudex in propria causa, was introduced. The remuneration of judges became regulated. And another important aspect of the division of powers, it was no longer allowed for the nobility to appear in court under arms. This was a huge discussion in the 16th century, as arms are the attribute of the citizens. And of course, the noble citizens considered this their fundamental right to show their arms when something important is happening in the political sphere. And legal theorists and philosophers argued against that, in a way underlining the peaceful character of a court. Finally, Vaičaitis observes that in the second and third statutes there were more provisions on the independence of judges than in the constitutions of Lithuania of 1791, 1918, and even 1992, which is currently in force. What we now call democracy was referred to in the statutes as the civic nation, while the first statute spoke of subjects, poddanie, pavaldinie in Lithuanian. The second and third spoke of citizens, cives, obywatele, piliecze. A citizen is a person who has certain rights and the duty to defend his country. This concept of the citizen was influenced by Polish practice and, as in the Kingdom of Poland, is closely linked to the parliamentary representation of citizens in a bottom-up electoral process. The two-chamber parliament, as the organ of the civic nation, began to be the sovereign next to the monarch. In the first statute, the monarch made decisions in consultation with the Senate. In the second statute, the lower house was given the right to vote on certain matters and became the third institution of central power alongside the monarch and the Senate. The monarch required the consent of the whole parliament for the following matters: the introduction of new taxes, the declaration of war, the promulgation of new laws, the election of the highest officials. In addition, he could exercise his function as supreme judge only in and with the cooperation of parliament. Therefore, the lower house of the Lithuanian Sejm, as a representation of the nobility, was a peculiar phenomenon comparable only to the Sejm of the Kingdom of Poland as its model and the Parliament of England. The statutes formally concern the rights of all states. In fact, they refer to the rights of the nobles of Christian faith coming from noble families, not city inhabitants or peasants, Jews and Tatars. Women were excluded. Only the nobility enjoyed the rights of inviolability, self-determination and participation in political life, which had been established in the 14th and 15th centuries to full extent. The principle of habeas corpus had been introduced back in 1447. The presumption of innocence and the principle of personal inviolability were linked to the Roman principle of audiatur et altera pars, that is to say, to the right of a fair trial. In absentia accusations are inadmissible, and the accusing party is supposed to face the accused eye to eye, oko for oko. However, in a formal sense, rather than in practice, also non-nobles enjoyed the rights of inviolability, and perpetual slavery was forbidden. All statutes contained the freedom to travel, especially to leave the country, and the freedom to marry. The right to appoint a legal representative was strengthened in the second statute, and free legal aid was guaranteed to widows, orphans, and others who cannot afford to pay a representative. In summary, the statutes, and especially the second statute, marked a sustainable breakthrough in the history of Lithuanian statehood. They defined the concept of citizen as opposed to subject, limited the power of the monarch, created a comprehensive and official judicial system, laid the foundations of parliamentarism. With the exception of the court system and the parliament, the principles of freedom and equality remained partly declaratory. The Union of Lublin, adopted only 3 years after the Second Statute in 1569, limited the scope of public law principles. Nevertheless, we can symbolically say that the Renaissance began with the work on the Lithuanian statutes in the 1520s and ended only with the adoption of enlightenment in the 18th century. The long-term effect can still be seen today. As the Lithuanian historian and politician Darius Kuolis put it shortly after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, quotation, "The second statute of Lithuania united Lithuanians and Ruthenians into one political community of equal nobles. Even after the Union of Lublin, it remained in force in the lands of Kiev, Volhynia, and Podolia in modern Ukraine, which had been torn away from Lithuania, and for a long time it preserved the symbolic link between the ancestors of the two free peoples, the Lithuanians and Ukrainians." End of quotation. But now let's have a look at some philosophical works that are related to the whole discussion about law, codification, and form of government. Let me start with Andreas Fritius Modrevius, one of the central figures of the 16th century. He lived in the Kingdom of Poland and was closely related to the circle of Erasmus of Rotterdam in Basel. He was closely related also to Philip Melanchthon, with whom he studied 4 years in Wittenberg. And he represented the point of view of an intellectual elite very much oriented to the West, very closely related to the royal court, and therefore in opposition to the nobility in many aspects, not in all aspects, but this history of the relations between philosophers and the nobility, in the case of Fritius Modrevius, ends in the 1560s in a rather pessimistic way, so to say. So they lost any way of understanding. Modrevius argued that law is actually to be defined in 2 ways. First, as a response to evil. Evil is an irreducible, essential, active, and first of all, highly creative principle in humans. And law is just reacting to evil. And second, law is what people accept as law. It's very easy. So law is what we have as law. This definition comes back in Laxmin 100 years later. So we just accept to be law what is treated as law, but we don't resign from improving the law. Modrevius was very critical about the customary law of the nobility, and he demands to introduce Roman law, not as a material, but as a collection of abstract principles to make law understandable to everyone. In his view, entitled to apply, interpret, and so on law is every rational being. That means every human being, including explicitly the peasants and the plebeians. The king, as the moderator of the Republic, should take an initiative to systematically codify and unify Polish law. A council of respected men should edit the text and then disband to ensure that there will be no one above the law. His understanding of law is based on justice for a part, but even more fundamentally on equitas. And equitas is, of course, the mitigation of overly harsh consequences of law. But in which equitas is also kind of formal equalitas, that is the equality of guilt and punishment, of merit and reward. And this equitas is, as he says, the fundamentum ac firmamentum rei publicae. It is always threatened by evil, which, with all its creativity, penetrates even the law. Thus, the Republic is forced to constantly reform itself, since law is essentially the response to human evil. So this gives a very clear impulse to reform the law, to codify, to write it down, to enter this kind of written culture of law. And Fritzsche's approach was not accepted in Poland, especially by the nobility, but of course it left important traces in the intellectual history, first. And second, we can observe that in Lithuania, a part of his views have been implemented. I would also like to mention Andreas Wolanus, a Calvinist theologian from Lithuania, who wrote the treatise De Libertate Politica Sive Civili, printed in 1572. This is more or less the time Moderavius dies and the last Jagiellonian king dies, and the history of the free election of the king starts a year later. He skillfully attempted to reconcile the approach of Fritzsche's Moderavius with the republican practice of the nobility. He abandoned the theory of law, and the metaphysical and ethical frameworks of his thought point to a Platonic and Stoic understanding of law. It's quite interesting that Wolanus was able to connect these two discourses of a very abstract, pro-Western, pro-Roman approach to law with the republican practice of the nobility. And it's also interesting to see that this noble discourse, as is often said, that was full of pride and self-congratulation and very critical about the plebeians, was also able of self-criticism. So you can observe this in Wolanus and later on in some works related to the so-called Sarmatian tradition also. August Mieleski Rotundus was a Pole who came to Lithuania right in the middle of the 16th century, and he was closely involved in the making of the second Lithuanian statute. There's still research underway to say what exactly has been his role. We know very less about that, but it's clear that he was closely involved. And he left a dialogue called Conversation of a Pole with a Lithuanian, printed in 1564, in a very critical moment between Poland and Lithuania, when the Lithuanians were under attack by the Muscovites and losing terrain in the east. And they needed the help of the Poles. And it was also clear at that time that the last king of the Jagiellonians would not have a son to continue his dynasty in a natural way. So a new solution was needed, both for the relations between the kingdom and the duchy and the form of government when this king will die. So this is a very intense discussion. And the Polish author, partly related also to Ruthenian and avant la lettre Ukrainian culture, Stanisław Orzechowski, Stanislaus Orychowius, wrote his Quincus, that's a very well-known book printed in 1564 and followed by a book that only partly has been finished by him in 1566 when he died, called Policja of the Polish Kingdom. So Policja is Politeia. And Orychowius had written in these books a philosophical and stylistic firework in vernacular Polish, which was a very important step, not in Latin. A Neoplatonic metaphysics of politics, a stirring and partly bizarre vision of noble freedom, combined with a fierce critique of Roman law, codification, and the Lithuanian model on the eve of the Union of Lublin. And Rotundus is the author who defends the Lithuanian point of view. Now, I would now like to come to the 17th century shortly and name a few figures that are central. First of all, Aaron Alexander Olizarovius, who in 1651 published the treatise De Politica Omnium Societate. He was a professor of law at the Vilnius University from 1644 to 1655. So from the beginning of the Department of Law, Faculty of Law, to the end of the splendid period of the University of Vilnius when the Muscovites invaded the city in 1655. He also was closely related to the University of Ingolstadt, where years before he published Questiones Politicae. And in his thought, natural law contains basic rules not only for the very first stages of human development, but also for the later stages when the state is founded and when there's formal law. And there is no immutable content of law and no deducible system of law content, but an openness of social order. So Olizarovius was convinced that, well, we can describe social order and political order to some extent, but it will change in the future. So this is not what we can base our political order on. However, any content of law must not contradict natural law. And like the Salamancan jurists, legal theorists, Olizarovius takes a psychological approach to law. Law is based on the right of persons. These rights must be respected, and respecting another person's right is the result of virtue and good faith, bona fides. And good faith is nothing but a clear conscience. So this is closely related to moral theology that comes from Spain. But the difference between the natural law thought in Poland and Lithuania in the 16th and in the 17th centuries is the following. In the 16th century, natural law is the light of critical reason which helps to identify unjust elements of law. In the 17th century, this is still true, but there are two new aspects. First, justice is based on civil rights defined in codification, especially in the Lithuanian statutes, but also in all these trials in the first half of the 16th century in Poland that politically failed. So justice is based on civil rights defined in codification, which are necessary foundations of the legal system, but formally and historically derived from privileges granted by the monarch to the nobility. So this is connected to the vision of the republic as a republic of the monarch, It does not at all disturb that. And second, natural law is given a new basis in psychology, ethics, and moral theology, and can therefore be understood in a more positive way as a source of positive law. What unites the two historical phases of philosophical theory of law and the idea of the state is the struggle against structural social violence, which threatens the internal balance of the Republic in every respect: social, institutional, formal, legal, psychological, and moral. Moreover, there is no conflict between nature and contract. On the contrary, nature is understood from an anthropological perspective as the nature of man, and it is the nature of man as a rational and social being to enter into contracts. Thus, several generations before Montesquieu and Rousseau, natural law and the social contract formed a platform of legal and political theory in Polish and Lithuanian discourse. However, it should be remembered that natural law and the social contract were understood as anthropological constants, interacting with social reality through time, rather than as a fictional prehistoric stage ending with the emergence of civil law and statehood. Moreover, this anthropological approach effectively hindered the reception of early modern, that is to say, 17th century paradigms of nature as the basis of empirical science and the naturalist thought of Hobbes or Pufendorf. To exaggerate an apparent paradox, one can say that in a very early modern understanding of natural law and contract, that this very early modern understanding of natural law and contract hindered the reception of the modern understanding, that is to say, that Renaissance thought held the place that Hobbes and Pufendorf wanted to take. And finally, let me mention two names also closely related to these projects of codification in Lithuania. This is Petrus Roisius, the Spanish lawyer, and finally Sigismundus Laxman. Petrus Roisius was born in Spain and studied in Italy. In 1540, he was invited to Krakow to teach Roman law. But in 1552, he moved to Vilnius because he was absolutely disappointed with what he met in Krakow. So the Poles were completely uninterested in Roman law. They didn't like it. And Petrus Roisius was interested in political career. So in 1552, he moved to Vilnius, where he died in 1571, an influential and wealthy man. As an expert in the field of Roman law, he was closely involved in the drafting of the Second Lithuanian Statute. His magnum opus are the Decisiones de Rebus in Sacro Auditorio Lituanico, printed in Krakow 1563, Frankfurt 1580, and Venice 1572. Roisius combined three traditions that in Poland-Lithuania were in conflict with each other. First, classical Roman law. Second, Catholic confessionalism. And third, the developing republican practice. The Decisiones are a compilation of individual cases. However, they allow us to follow general principles. Let me mention some of them. First, he says, much like FISIER, that existing law must be critically analyzed and purified of false elements. So this is his view of the work of a lawyer. Divine law and natural law, although different in their ontological status, are almost identical in their functions. The divine law, he says, like its author, God, is immutable and prevails in every forum. That is, in every court practice, intellectual discourse, or individual conscience. To act against divine law, even if permitted by human law, is a crime. What has been established by divine law cannot be removed by custom. what has been established by law of nature cannot be changed by custom. So this is clearly a strategy of introducing divine law, natural law, as a new platform from which we can criticize existing law and develop it in the direction that we consider to be good. But divine law can be self-limiting, leaving room for human action, especially in politics and legislation. The princes are wise men and can therefore modify divine law when human nature requires it. So he enters also into this kind of Spanish discourse on psychology. Some regulations of divine law are unquestionable. For example, the prohibition of interest rates for loans. Others can be of limited effectiveness and therefore suspended. For example, those regulations that tend to hinder the collections of the tenth, so to say, the tax paid to the holders of higher church offices. And of course, we can ask if it was by chance that Reusius owed his own considerable wealth to church offices and the tenth, and he fought fiercely against Jewish credit action. So, as we see here, this is the connection between law theory, legal theory, and practice. And the last point, I just want to name Sigismundus Lautner and just say a few words about the project. Well, this is the first volume of our series of source editions. Sigismundus Lautner, De Jure et Justitia, manuscript source from 1647, kept at the University of Vilnius, closely related to the whole process of the foundation of the Faculty of Law. And Lautner completely relied on Spanish and Portuguese sources. So Salamanca Coimbra presented a theory of contract as the basis of the Republic. So what we already heard, that human nature is contract making. We can see this in this source as the most fundamental principle of any law, private law, clearly private law, but also of public law and the functioning of the Republic. Well, as I said, this is the first volume, and let me just mention the volumes that followed. The second one is a lecture on logic held in 1620 at Ingolstadt by a professor, most probably stemming from the Commonwealth of the Two Nations, perhaps from Prussia, perhaps from Lithuania, perhaps he was Calvinist, but we don't know that. It's a quite interesting source as he connects the teaching of logic to the discussion of politics and law. So this is the second volume, and you can find both volumes already on the webpage of Sublupa, which is the publisher and author. And the sources to follow are the Philosophia Practica of the same author in Ingolstadt in 1612. Quite an interesting discussion of the whole practical philosophy, but the most impressive part is the third one on politics, where he discusses Jean Baudin from a Republican point of view. Very, very interesting discussion. Then we have 3 volumes that contain Prelectiones Politicae from the end of the 17th century, given by professors of ethics, which show the variety of political theories. So they are very different. One author, Mozelewski, is a very succinct Aristotelian author who just makes a lot of order in his terminology, and Puchiłowski a year later is engaged with well, mythology first of all, and history and geography and so on. Finally, we have Maciej Sarbiewski, Dedeo and De Angelis, two quite big sources from 1632, lectures held at the University of Vilnius by one of best known Polish poets and intellectuals of the 17th century, unedited up to now. And we are adding two lectures on ethics from the middle of the 18th century from Kiev, kept at the National Library of Ukraine, showing the effect of Renaissance thought, Jesuit thought, from the 17th century that became the basis of teaching of moral theology, ethics, and so on in the Kiev and Mohyl Academy, even in the 18th century. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Yes. To ask, have you ever thought of preparing a workshop for members of Polish Parliament on this issue? I think that you would say.
I'm afraid they're busy with other topics, but yes, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me present our second speaker, Dr. Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor. Barbara teaches in the Department of History of Old Polish Literature at the Faculty of Polish Studies, Jagiellonian University in Prague. She obtained PhD in Literary Studies from Jagiellonian University in 2012. Her PhD dissertation topic was the concept of early modernity in contemporary cultural discourses. She is a member of editorial board of Biologłos, Polylog, a journal published at the Faculty of Polish Studies at the same university. From 2006 to 2008, she worked as a lecturer of Polish language and culture at the University of Kent in Belgium. Between 2013 and 2016, she conducted a research project, Respublika Postliteraria, the concept of literature, reading, and literary culture, new semantical revisions. It was the FUGA program financed by the Polish National Science Center. Barbara's research interests revolve around the philosophy of literature and the history of ideas, with a particular emphasis on the transformations of humanistic anthropology and the philosophy of culture, posthumanism, and changing concept of commonality. Her latest book, Respublika Postliteraria, published in Polish in 2020, explores the contemporary semantic transformations of the concept of literature, reading, and literary culture.
Thank you. First, I'm honored to be part of the seminar and be the co-speaker of Professor Stefan Huber. Just a minute to launch my presentation. Try to split it onto screens, so it's a little bit complicated. Okay, the first screen is on, and now I try to share my screen. Yes, now I think everything is ready. So we will start. The title of my paper is Early Modern Protracted Discourse in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the third book of the dialogue on the orator, Cicero laments the disastrous divorce initiated by Socrates. Do we have some problems? Okay, just translation. Okay, so I restart now. So in the third book of the dialogue on the Rhetor, Cicero laments the disastrous divorce initiated by Socrates. I quote, "He separated in his discussion the ability to thinking wisely and speaking gracefully, though they are in nature united. Hence arose that divorce, as it were, of the tongue from the heart, a division certainly absurd, useless, and reprehensible, that one class of persons should teach us to think and another to speak. In this manner, Cicero continues, Socrates and his followers dismantled the previously existing marvelous community of speaking and understanding. However, it is this very division that informs another dialogue by Cicero on the same subject. I quote again, "It is therefore easy to distinguish the eloquence which we are treating in this work from the style of the philosophers. The latter is gentle, academic, and has no equipment of words or phrases that catch the popular fancy. It is not arranged in rhythmical periods, but is loose in structure. There is no anger in it, no hatred, no ferocity, no pathos, no shrewdness. It might be called a chaste, pure, and modest virtue. Consequently, it is called conversation rather than oratory. Presented in this manner, Ciceronian virgin philosophy, adorned in her ascetic garment, appears distinctly different to the embellished lady philosophy in Boethius' Consolation. Is the philosophical sermon truly distinct from oratio for Cicero and his early modern followers? Which lady do they accompany? In the works of Polish philosopher Adam Burski, a professor of moral philosophy at the Academy of Zamść from 1597, we find an illustrative and representative example. In one of his treatises, Burski paraphrases a Ciceronian fragment about philosophical sermon and rhetorical oratio. Paradoxically, he does this within a treatise concerning the art of rhetorical elocution, visibly demonstrating its usefulness for philosophical argumentation. Simultaneously, Burski is the author of Dialectica Ciceronis from 1604, a book on logic referred to by Wojciech Ryczek as a polyphonic commentary on the works of Cicero. The philosophical works produced in the early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth exhibited genuine polyphony, not only in their content, but also their forms. This phenomenon is characterized by an extensive spectrum of genres, encompassing not only conventional and standard academic modes of philosophical discourse, such as treatises, dissertations, dialogues, and commentaries, but also those situated on the periphery, often regarded as literary texts that are either inspired or influenced by philosophical ideas. This diverse range extends to include forms such as apophthegmata, rhetoriology, philosophical elegy and ode, sermon, oration, philosophical dictionary, and allegorical poem, to name a few. Yet within such a representative enumeration, it is imperative to acknowledge the notable and pervasive forms intrinsic to the text of diverse communities in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including Polish Jews, Muslims, Tatars, Armenians, Karaites, and writers of the Orthodox Church. The inclusion of mashal, tafsir, and rabbinic responses is crucial, as they should not be omitted from the purview of any comprehensive research synthesis, regardless of its conciseness. Their philosophical potential, though historically marginalized, cannot be understated. These forms have, for an extended period, been overlooked due to various factors. The phenomenon of allography has played a significant role in this context, where many texts were composed in alphabet different to the one currently in use. Illustrative instances of this phenomenon are found in the writings of Polish Muslims, the Tatars, we name them Kitab, which are inscribed in the Arabic alphabet despite their language being Old Polish or Old Belarusian. Another intriguing case is presented by Jewish text written in Yiddish, but employing the Hebrew alphabet. Furthermore, it's crucial to underscore the importance of Armenian literature, which in the 16th century was frequently transcribed in Polish using the Armenian alphabet. Notably, its philosophical significance is immeasurable, encapsulating not only a remarkable diversity of genres and forms, particularly in the legacy of Stefan Lehasy and Stefan Roszko, but also encompassing copies, translations, and the earliest manuscripts of essential works, including those of Philo of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Nemesius of Emesa. Presently, intensive research on Armenian writings preserved in Poland is being undertaken at the Center of Armenian Cultural Studies in Poland, with specific emphasis on the scholarly contributions and numerous works of Firuz Natsakhanyan. What adds to the intrigue in this context is the first form of philosophical conversation, where its rhetorical persuasiveness, effectiveness, and ultimately its conversive potential are problematized and illuminated across a multitude of texts written in the Commonwealth. It is paramount to underscore that these texts often serve as records of significant and enduring discussions regarding the specificity and gravity of philosophical discourse. One of the most captivating debates of this nature unfolded in the 16th century among Jewish rabbis, initially centered on the value of the Maimonides philosophy, whose works found a place in Krakow and Lublin editions of the Talmud. This discussion gradually evolved, with Shlomo Luria and Moshe Sarnes emerging as the primary adversaries into a discourse about the value of philosophy and secular sciences at large. In essence, it constituted a continuation of discussions that had predominantly occurred in the 12th and 13th centuries in Western Europe. Within Sephardic culture, Maimonides represented the philosophical perspective, and in the 16th century in the Commonwealth, his worthy successor emerged in the form of Moshe Sarnes. This interpretation draws upon the research of Krzysztof Pilarczyk, unfortunately passed away last year, a key figure among Polish scholars engaged in early modern Jewish thought in the Commonwealth. Pertinently, is Sarnes' defense of philosophy, a noteworthy excerpt of which is highlighted in Pilarczyk's work, holds particular significance in this context. I quote, "I admit that if I were to distance myself from a branch of knowledge because of its negative influence on religion, I would do so with the Kabbalah, for it is far more dangerous than philosophy. I do philosophy only on Saturdays, when everyone is out walking or resting, and all week long I study the Talmud and its commentaries. The philosophy practiced on the Sabbath aligns with the divine contemplation of creation on the seventh day, constituting a form of imitation of God. This emulation is presumed to adhere to the logic inherent in the image of God as the most perfect form. Viewed through this lens, it serves as a compelling argument in favor of engaging in philosophy. Consequently, it can be regarded as a distinctive protracted text, underscoring the significance of philosophical discourse and encouraging the pursuit of bios theoreticus. A life wherein philosophical reflection attains the zenith among all other forms of action. Similar discussions, however, were not confined solely to the diverse groups mentioned earlier. Preserved textual records bear witness to a dynamic exchange of ideas and rhetorical literary forms that transcended these divisions. Language and religious barrier did not prove insurmountable. An illustrated case is the ongoing dialogue between Polish-Lithuanians and Polish Tatars, as evidenced by records that highlight the depth of interest on both sides in comprehending the nuances of the opponent's fault, paradoxically considered a peculiar ally. Unitarians were frequently accused in writings by representatives of other Christian denominations of harboring views akin to Islamic ideas. Interestingly enough, in Tatar literature, there is a discernible curiosity about the perspectives and literary forms of other denominations and religions. Notably, in 1645 Kitab, from the collection of the University Library in Kazan, featuring records in 3 languages, Belarusian, Arabic, and Turkish, we encounter not only various narrative and didactic wisdom texts, such as Muhammad's conversation with Satan around the wisdom of God, but also a Muslim-Jewish dispute, particularly intriguing within this context. In my capacity as a scholar in the field of the history of literature, encompassing both the history of ideas and the evolution of literature and rhetorical thoughts, my lecture's focus differs from that of the distinguished opening speaker, Professor Stefan Huber. Specifically, I'm intrigued by how writers in the early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth redefined the very essence of philosophical discourse, questioning its value, autonomy, and position within other public and literary discourse of the era. Simultaneously, these writers demonstrated an acute awareness of its limits and shortcomings. Given the constraints of this brief presentation, I will narrow my focus to one particularly interesting and crucial aspect: the popularization of a philosophical protracted discourse in literature from the early modern Commonwealth. My subsequent presentation will be divided into 2 primary segments. Firstly, in a succinct manner, I will discuss the popularization of studies on protractics, which redefine the very concept of protractic as a philosophical genre. Secondly, I will underscore the diverse array and richness of genres, forms, and modes of philosophical discourse in Poland. My focus will center on elements derived from the protractic tradition, illuminating its popularity and persuasive utility on Polish soil. Throughout my analysis, I will identify socio-political and cultural factors that spurred the adoption and renegotiation of the polymorphic protractic discourse in the Commonwealth. While presenting only a select few examples deemed representative, I'm able to categorize the most significant groups of such texts, proposing their collective treatment within the framework of narrow modern protractic discourse or protractic intertextuality. A key objective is to elevate these texts from their current marginal position within the philosophical discourse. As we anticipate further discussions, it is crucial to highlight the distinctive chronology of philosophical literature in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in relation to Western Europe. The substantial reduction in genres and forms of philosophical literature observed in 13th century Western Europe, I refer here not all to the research of Eileen Sweeney, occurs much later in the context under consideration. Numerous genres typical of the 12th century continue to thrive successfully. However, it is essential to note that this phenomenon is not solely a result of the extended duration of medieval philosophical culture, as often portrayed in Polish studies on the development of scholastic thought. A fundamental factor that should be acknowledged is the influence of different socio-political conditions, that determine the persistent demand for distinctly polyphonic dialogical texts, creating a space for dispute where numerous voices, attitudes, and values clash. A vivid example is evident in the interreligious polemical dialogue mentioned earlier, which thrives notably in 12th and 14th century Europe, often drawing inspiration from Carolingian models. Exemplary instances include Abelard's dialogues featuring a dialogue among a Jew, a Christian, and a philosopher, or dialogue between a Christian and a Jew by Gilbert Crispin. Above all, the dialogues of ReNeW stand out, characterized by respect for Muslim interlocutors and aligning with his understanding of rhetoric as transformative speech based on verbal caritas. However, a shift becomes apparent with Petrus Alphonsi's dialogue, marking a quantitative and qualitative increase in dialogues contra judeos. In these dialogues, what begins as an illusory conversation ultimately transforms into a total condemnation of the opponent, effectively silencing their voice. Against this historical backdrop, the noteworthy popularity of interreligious dialogues in Poland during the 16th and 17th centuries stands out. In these conversations, a clear favoring of a specific perspective and position does not preclude the possibility of quoting opponents' arguments, allowing for at least a minimal acknowledgement of their voice. At this juncture, in elucidating the connection between the polymorphism of philosophical literature and the multicultural realities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it is permanent, in my opinion, to delve into the category of protracted discourse. However, it necessitates a redefinition in light of the intensively evolving research in this area over recent years. Unfortunately, the limited space here does not allow for even a brief summary of the richness of content and the mentioned studies and the specifics of individual approaches. In the context of the analysis conducted here, what is most significant is the distinct perspective on protracting, especially in the works of John Henderson Collins and Miguel Herrero de Yaremolin. It is viewed not so much as a formalized genre existing since the 5th century before Christmas era, but rather as a more broadly understood discourse of protractic. Sophie van der Meeren describes it as a mode of discourse, Daniel Markovich as a protractic intertextuality, and Collins uses the concept of protractic rhetorics. Researchers generally agree that the genre-specific understanding of protractic is possible only in reference to later texts, post-Platonic works that primarily draw on the pattern established by the reconstructed protractic of Aristotle and the subsequently lost Ciceronian dialogue Hortensius. This diverse group of texts includes Neoplatonic, Stoic, and even Epicurean protractics, as well as various Christian protractics dating back to the 1st century. Additionally, there are texts that ironically transform the protractic discourse, such as Lucian's Sales of Lives and Ausonius' Encouragement to Ransom. It is worth noting that self-critical irony is inherent in this convention, already present in Platonic and pseudo-Platonic protractics, such as the crucial dialogues Euthydemus and Plutarch. Without definitely resolving the issue of protractic as a formalized genre of philosophical expression, recent studies have shifted focus to the oldest Greek poetry, predating the philosophical poetry of Parmenides and Anaxagoras, as the actual source of protractic speech, logos protracticos. Functionally, it is defined as a speech aimed at radically transforming the listener, Importantly, it assumes that the recipient of the text does not share the speaker's beliefs and may be reluctant or adopt an ironic distance. One of the oldest Greek literary sources for such a communicative relationship is found in Hesiod's epic poem addressed to an absent and hostile brother. John Henderson Collins brings attention to a particularly interesting and previously unnoticed dimension of protracted discourse. He describes the historical conditions of its popularization in the 4th century Athens in a situation of economic and political prosperity that translates into what he calls the Athenian marketplace of ideas. This environment involves intense competition among philosophical schools, simultaneously representing competing models of education and anthropological paradigms. Importantly, it is characterized by anthropological optimism, a belief in the possibility of positive transformations in the human person. In these conditions, Collins convincingly argues that there is a specific demand for a speech that activates multiple perspectives and therefore sets in motion various genres. According to Collins, strictly genre-based approaches to protractic are insufficient to understand the full spectrum of protractic practices. He identifies 4 main characteristics of such discourse: dialogicity, agonism, situationality, and rhetoric. Quoting Collins, protractic is dialogic and can be understood only if we realize that it works by virtue of its inclusion of an interaction as competing voices and conventional genres. He emphasizes that each protractic reveals a multitude of competing attitudes and sets of values, highlighting the erroneous possibility of a straightforward replacement of one set as another, which could be equally deceptive. Therefore, protractics often rely on complex strategies to neutralize opposing voices. Parody, hyperbole, and ironic distance towards philosophical sermons are thus consistently present in these texts, not just in specific parodies of protractic. This nuanced understanding underscores the dynamic and multifaceted nature of protractic discourse in the context of a competitive intellectual marketplace. While scholars from Geiser to Collins and Markovich have acknowledged the presence of constant literary topoi facilitating discussions about the protractic convention, a comprehensive description has not been provided thus far. In my opinion, this co-creation determines the formation of protractic intertextuality, in the context of which roughly the same set of images, motives, and formulas undergoes recontextualization over the centuries. These same images and new contexts are significantly subordinated to new persuasive functions. I will enumerate only the most important motifs that recur in the context of Old Polish literature. This includes, above all, the motif of Heracles at the crossroads, derived from the text of Prodicus of Chaos, often as in pseudo-Isocrates and later the patristic writers, contrasting with the motif of Tantalus. Heracles and Tantalus become images of 2 sons of Zeus choosing opposite paths in life. They thus represent the conflict of different axiologies oriented towards spiritual or material values. A variation of the 2-path theme is the image of 2 processions, virtue and fortune, as in Gallen's protractics. Noteworthy is the formula of leaving the choice of the best path to the recipient, among several presented in the text. Here, one must also place specific catalogues of ways of life present in poetic texts, already in Sappho and especially in Horace. Another popular motif is the analogy between the practice of a philosopher and the practice of a physician, as well as the metaphor of the health of the soul. Additionally, the motifs taken from the Odyssey, like Kierkegaard changing man into beast, sirens, or Scylla and Charybdis, are of great popularity as well. These and other motifs belong, of course, to the rhetorical bonum commune. However, their combined coexistence in text encouraging the choice of philosophical life and simultaneously commanding the abandonment of the pursuit of transient values allows, in my opinion, to speak about the conventional protracted literary topoi. It's only at this point that we can move on to the central issue of my lecture, the exploration of philosophical protracted discourse in the Commonwealth is an intriguing avenue of study with a substantial number of texts referencing that protracted tradition in various ways. While individual works have been acknowledged for their protracted character in previous studies, they have not been collectively considered as part of the common set. Noteworthy examples include Albert Koszkowski's work on Paweł of Krosno and Elvira Buszewicz's research on the lecturers Grzegorz Sambor. The interest in the protracted tradition in the Commonwealth can be traced to several factors. Firstly, exposure to a multitude of texts from various traditions, including Platonic, Ciceronian, philosophical diatribes like those of Epictetus, patristic texts such as the Protractics of the Alexandrians or the speeches of Basil the Great, and prosymmetric protractics originating from the Boethian tradition. Secondly, the intense reception of Erasmus of Rotterdam's writings, often adopting the form of protractic, played a crucial role. Thirdly, the influence of the philosophical didactic poetry of Gregory of Nazianzus at the end of the 16th century is observed, particularly in connection with the translation of his Bible. Beyond literary sources, it's essential to consider the functional factors influencing the reception of the protracted tradition. However, before delving into these factors, appropriately categorizing the existing corpus of identified protracted texts is a necessary step. Firstly, the identified protracted texts in the Commonwealth will include academic exhortatory speeches, serving as eulogies to philosophical art and employing a characteristic set of rhetorical commonplaces. There are numerous examples of such speeches, and they align with the European trend of developing humanistic phrases of academics and arts within their walls. It's crucial to recognize that these texts shouldn't be viewed merely as occasional epidactic rhetoric, but as legitimate voices in the contemporary European debate on the content of education. Alongside these exhortatory speeches, a second equally significant group comprises introductions to translations of philosophical works and their commentaries, as seen in the case of Midecki's translation of Aristotle's work. Here, too, the presence of elaborate, protracted commonplaces is both conventional and significant, serving as an attempt to justify the social utility and even necessity of speculation and theoretical life. These introductions played a role in framing the translated philosophical content within a broader context, emphasizing its relevance and value in society. The third group, which is intriguing in many respects, would include quite a few pedagogical texts, often employing protracted schemes. alongside well-known works in Polish research, such as the writings of Szymon Marycjusz of Pilzno, Andrzej Modrzewski, Razum Gliczner, Mikołaj Rej, and Sebastian Petryca of Pilzno, it is essential to highlight a lesser known now, but widely popular up till 18th century Jewish treatise Meneka Rybka, Rebecca's Nurture, of Rivka Bat Meir, known also as Tikhtin Rebecca. This work was dedicated to the education and upbringing of women and children. The 16th century text by the author born in Tykocin in northeastern Poland not only demonstrates her familiarity with the ethical traditions of Hebrew writings, but is also formally elaborate. Its composition is based on a visual scheme resembling a menorah. The 7 parts of the treatise correspond to different spheres of women's lives, which in turn seems to echo the Stoic schema of oikiosis, dynamic circles of communities in which a person simultaneously functions. This treatise was printed in 1618, simultaneously in Prague and Krakow. Finally, as the 4th and particularly interesting group from a poetic perspective, I would like to highlight exhortative dialogues, a tradition that begins in our context around the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries. An early important and representative example is the dialogue by Mateusz of Krakow called Rationale Opum Divinorum. This treatise, consisting of 7 dialogues between a father and a son, is crucially notable for both participants being equal conversational partners, both asking questions and attempting to answer them. The content of this conversation revolves not only around the question of the existence of evil in the world, but also forms a specific anthropology, emphasizes the dignity and freedom of man, as well as his ability to rationally shape himself. These ideas are crucial in the later medieval and early modern Polish legal and political thought, simultaneously characteristic of the optimistic anthropology of protractics. In the 16th century, there are many such protractic dialogues referencing the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions, often through the works of Marsilio Ficino, and utilizing various often less known models. Selected interesting examples include dialogues by Adam of Bohemia, Wawrzyniec Korwin, and Grzegorz of Sanborn. Korwin's Dialogus de Mentis Saluberium and Persuasionem is a highly elaborate and formally adept protractic, falling within the spectrum of Boethian poetics with its oniricism and prosimetrum. It is encrusted with reference to the protractic Ode 1 to Maecenas of Horace, Plato's Symposium, and perhaps unnoticed in previous research, chapter 28 of the Book of Job, a hymn about wisdom, based on the symbolism of 2 paths, the path of human knowledge, leading into the depths of the earth, and the path of divine wisdom, that is difficult for human to access. This is an exceptionally interesting example of combining various protractic motives, consciously drawn from diverse sources and largely united by a symbolic framework. In this dialogue, a nature man laments his own childlessness, reflecting on the barrenness of his life in the poetically created setting of an autumn garden. Muses appear to him, presenting the true meaning of human life and its rational fruits through a series of songs. The 5th group, closely related to the previous one, consists of visionary allegorical poems with notable representation in Jan Dantyszek, De Virtutis et Fortuna Differentia Somnium, from 1510, Mikołaj Rej, Speculum, as in Polish Zwierciadło, and in the much later poem by Kasper Twardowski, Łódź Młodzi, the Ship of Youth. Each of these texts contains a wealth of protracted motives and would require separate, extensive discussion. For brevity, I will only mention Dantyszek's work, which has been extensively discussed. Recently, Ewelina Drzewiecka pointed to its apparent resemblance to the letter of Aeneas Piccolomini, likely an important mediating text. I argue that this poem is primarily derived from the tradition of Galen's protractic text, exhortation to the arts, protreptikos logos epitas technos. Both texts are based on a common scheme, with the dominant motif of the procession of fortune and virtue depicted in very similar ways in both texts. Importantly, we know that Dantyszek was familiar with Galen's work, as evidenced by the letter to Christoph Hale, in which he thanks him for the declaration of dedicating the translation of Galen's works to him. This is another significant example of the intense penetration of texts into Polish territory that contributed to protractic intertextuality, and not just the obvious works in this context, such as Cicero, Tusculan Disputations, or On Duties. The protractic discourse described here should not be reduced solely to the phenomenon of Polish Ciceronianism, although the thesis of Tadeusz Minkowski and Albert Gorzkowski that humanness in Poland is primarily Ciceronianism is undoubtedly valid. The sixth and final group, both significant and beyond the scope of detailed treatment in this context, comprises philosophical elegies often inspired by the Lucretian traditions. Its two most outstanding representatives are undoubtedly Jan Kochanowski and Maciej Kazimierz-Sarbiewski. Motifs borrowed from this tradition, not necessarily directly, can also be found in the works of Grzegorz Owsanok, Mikołaj Rej, Adam Poniński, and many others. Although scholars, including Tadeusz Sinko, Mieczysław Brożew, and Rabuszewicz, and Piotr Urbański, have emphasized significant Lucretian philosophical inspiration in the Polish context, these influences have not been adequately explored yet. They are important within the context of the protractic tradition, particularly the Lucretian idea of didactic poetry, which can effectively convey philosophical content more than other forms. Following this necessarily brief overview of the groups of textual sources that could be collectively considered within the early modern protractic discourse in the Commonwealth, we can revisit the previously posed question in an attempt to elucidate the main reasons for the noticeable popularization of the protracted discourse in the early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Three factors stand out as particularly crucial in my view. Firstly, the often emphasized here polyphonic potential of the protracted discourse, its ability to incorporate and harmonize diverse, often conflicting voices. This feature proved particularly crucial in the multicultural realities of the Commonwealth. Secondly, an inspiring analogy appears to emerge between the political, economic realities of Athenian democracy, as described by scholars like Collins and Markowicz, and the reality of the noble democracy depicted by Polish scholars, historians, and philosophers. In both these communities, there is a notable extension of civil freedoms, including a relatively free expression of religious, political, and social discourse compared to other regions this time. Moreover, those societies exhibit favorable conditions for economic development, and during periods of temporary economic prosperity, anti-materialistic discourse gains significant importance, characteristic of protracted texts. This discourse involves a distinct opposition between a life focused on the pursuit of material goods and a philosophical life centered on the search for true values. Such discourse proves highly functional in conditions of intense enrichment within a specific social group, in this case the nobility, coupled with the phenomenon of conspicuous consumption. Jan Kochanowski's Polish language odes and Latin elegies provide an interesting and representative example, skillfully transforming Corinthian protracted catalogues of ways of life. Finally, it is also worth noting the significance associated with the idea of simple language, one that should not separatize with the language of philosophy. This idea emerges on the one hand in the humanistic dispute with scholasticism, critiquing its refined distinctions, and on the other hand, it is important in the discourse of Polish Unitarians, conceptualized as the idea of a self-evident truth of faith clear to everyone. As an illustration, in the conclusion of the lecture, I will refer to an example from the introduction to the treatise on the person of Adam Gosławski from Babel, written in 1612. Interestingly, it combines both of these motives, the anti-scholastic and the Unitarian. This is an extremely interesting example. The author, a Unitarian, opposes, like all humanistic writers, the refinement and incomprehensibility of the language of scholastic philosophy. He does this in the name of the unlearned, simple person who should be able to understand the simplicity of celestial truth, and therefore the basic theological dogmas. Rabbinic commentaries also become a symbol of false learning, a characteristic sign of the growing aversion throughout Europe at the time towards Judaic exegesis of scripture. However, simultaneously defends the Boethian definition of personhood, which in his understanding forms the basis for the critique of Trinitarian theology, referring to one of the constant protracted motives, the image of Scylla Charybdis. He explains this paradoxical writing of a difficult and incomprehensible theological and philosophical text based on the classical categories of Boethian logic, which also serve traditional scholasticism. He does not renounce the hermeneutic language of philosophy, although he feels compelled to provide explanations regarding its use. In the conclusion of this treatise, he once again addresses his adversary, Jakub Martini, recalling Martini's invectives against him. We learn that Martini calls Gosławski a heretic, a pseudo-philosopher, a disciple of dialectics, who behaves as if his brain were in his heel and his prudence in his feet. For Gosławski, these descriptions do not align with the rule of neighborly love or the ethos of a learned person. However, Martini's invective seems to be, in my opinion, an erudite reference to Clement of Alexandria's protracted work Exhortation to the Heaven, where in the 7th chapter he compares people who speak without knowing the truth to those who would like to walk without having feet. Simultaneously, the entire chapter of Alexandrian serves as an affirmation of poetic language, as the only one that perhaps directly reveals its own awareness of the lack of truth, its own absurdity, recalling once again the Ciceronian metaphor of the ascetic philosophy maiden, devoid of rhetorical ornaments and emotional expression. It is certainly not this philosophy lady that guides most Polish authors of philosophical texts. The real guide is the Boethian philosophy lady. Thanks to her ornate rhetoric, she's not only persuasive, but also understandable. and the social translation of philosophical ideas she performs. In the lecture, which aimed to present the vast area of research in a concise form, I was only able to make some preliminary and, in fact, an itinerary sketch pointing out selected problems. The complete version of my research is to be published in next year. Thank you for your attention.
It was very rich and fascinating paper. And now we are passing to the comments and questions from our respondents. So let me introduce our first respondent. Dorota Pietrzyk-Reeves is an associate professor of political science and political philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She works there at the Institute of Political Science and International Relations and holds the position of Vice Dean for Research and International Cooperation of the Faculty of International and Political Studies. Her main areas of research and teaching include political philosophy, democratic theory, democratization and civil society in Central and Eastern Europe, early modern republicanism and neo-republicanism, multiculturalism and political education. Currently, she leads two international research projects. First, the conditions of civil society in Central and Eastern Europe 30 years after, a comparative perspective affiliated in Krakow and funded by the Polish National Science Center. And the second, recovering Europe's parliamentary culture, typical 1500s to 1700s, a new comparative approach to political assemblies affiliated at Oxford University and supported by John Feldbaum. Dorota Pietrzyk-Reeves published in such journals as History Compass, East European Politics and Societies, Cambridge Review of International Affairs, PS, Political Science and Politics, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, or Acta Politica. Her most recent book is Polish 16th Century Republican Discourse, Cambridge University Press 2020. Dorota, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll try to be short because we already had the opportunity to listen for 2 hours. So let me first thank the two speakers for these two very interesting and promising lectures, and also congratulations on the project and its results. So as we know, Renaissance political philosophy in Poland and Lithuania is particularly rich in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so far it has been analyzed mainly by Polish historians. Well, we do not have intellectual historians in Poland, and I don't think we particularly need to follow this Anglo-Saxon, mainly British and American fashion here. But I do think that we need other disciplines other than history, such as literary studies, law, philosophy, political philosophy, and political science, and I happen to represent the last two, to be more involved in interdisciplinary, comparative, and collaborative research on the topics of today's lectures. And of course, after having completed a major monograph on Polish Republican discourse in the 16th century, and now been involved in this international project on early modern parliamentary culture, I do think that much work still needs to be done on the philosophical and more broadly intellectual heritage of Poland-Lithuania. There's a vast source material available which allows for extensive, fresh, and interdisciplinary analysis, and as it happens, for discovering new sources in several languages. I'm very happy that this project is doing exactly that. So I will first refer to Stefan's lecture, and I will say much more about Stefan's lecture because it's very close to my own research than on the second lecture. So Stefan said that in trying to understand the characteristics of Polish and Lithuanian political philosophy, we should focus on local social structures, political practice, and historical chronology, rather than on the gold standards of Western thought. But having said that, we easily discover that these golden standards, such as rule of law, mixed government, or the liberty of the ancients, is there too in the Polish and Polish-Lithuanian discourse, in the Polish philosophical political discourse, as we could perhaps say. Also, I think Stefan is right saying that Poland-Lithuania was neither behind nor more advanced than other European countries at the time. It had its own path and its own unique political model. The first ever union parliament that was established with the Polish-Lithuanian Union in 1569. And it had a thriving theory and practice of liberty, which intellectual historians today call Republican liberty. Polish and Lithuanian scholars were very familiar with both ancient, medieval, and contemporary works of philosophy. And their contribution, as both our speakers have already argued, was very much influenced by this unique experience of the Commonwealth of the two nations, and in fact, more than two nations. So now the rule of law is one of the essential components of the order of Rzeczpospolita, Respublika, or a monarchical republic, or monarchia mixta, and one of the essential safeguards of citizens' liberty. There is already extensive scholarship done by Polish historians, such as Professor Grześkowiak-Krwawicz, Edwardo Paliński, Chońska Mika, myself, already available on this component of a 16th century political thought. But there is still a lot to say on other works that normally are not covered by historians. I think Stefan is doing exactly that. But it would be interesting to know how you, Stefan, approach this question and how your approach is different and what methodological perspective you prefer while, addressing this very question of the rule of law in the context of the mixed government of Rzeczpospolita. When talking about sources of law, somehow natural law or higher law was not mentioned in that introduction when you were talking about more general sort of concepts of Rzeczpospolita. But then you also mentioned examples of various philosophers who actually took this direction, who were thinking in terms of some higher law, such as natural law or logos or Stoic law, and so on. So it would be interesting to explore this a little bit more, whether there is a kind of essential, a kind of very substantive discussion on higher sources of law or not. Now, the very concept of Rzeczpospolita, Latin Respublica versus the state and monarchy has also been subject of scholarly research. And what I think is essential here is the fact that we are talking about the Ciceronian Respublica, which is a mixed constitution or a mixed government. So we don't need to say a monarchical republic, because monarchy is already part of Respublica, unless we want to emphasize that the monarchical element of the republic is represented by a monarch and not by a doge or consul or president. So in this sense, a monarchical republic makes sense. And yes, Stefan is absolutely right saying that Rzeczpospolita is not l'État or lo Stato, the state, as it really is a Ciceronian or even Aristotelian political community, which is based on its same, right? And the same, which is the name of the Polish, and from 1569, Polish-Lithuanian Representative Assembly. And here again, it is not a parliament. So I would really avoid using the term parliament, because it makes sense to use it in the context where it is used, which is in England and Scotland as well as Ireland in the 16th century. So I would recommend using Sejm rather than Parliament while talking about the Central Political Assembly, and Sejmik when talking about regional or local assemblies of Poland-Lithuania. And what also needs to be stressed is the fact that these three components of a Respublika are present exactly there in the Sejm: the monarch, the Senate, which is the aristocratic component, and the House of Envoys, which is the lower house of the nobility, which is the democratic component. And only there in Izba Poselska, the lower house, this noble democracy is functioning, as well as in the Sejmiks, but even Sejmiks are attended by law, by senators. So the whole system of Poland-Lithuania cannot be called a noble democracy. So I would really avoid using that, as it is always a mixed government, which even during interregna does not function solely as a noble democracy, meaning the lower house of the Sejm, but it is the two chambers then coming together under these exceptional circumstances to make decisions about imminent state matters. Also there is one phrase that was used, which perhaps requires a little bit more attention, the phrase that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a form of government based on the people. This can be a little bit problematic unless we use a very inclusive sense of Rzeczpospolita as a political community of all its members, like the one found in Frycz Modrzewski, but not in Orzechowski, or in the political practice. I will not comment on Sarmatian mythology because I think the analysis is already very complex even without it, but does in fact explain this mythology, some of the traditional ways of thinking about the uniqueness of Rzeczpospolita that could only be compared with the Roman Republic or Serenissima Venezia, the other two republics, based on the liberty of their citizens. Still, it would be great to elaborate on this idea of civic nation. I really like that phrase in this very context, or in fact, civic nations in plural that together form a union. And finally, as regards the discussion of various philosophers' views on law and the rule of law, I find this very illuminating, and I expect that it will be presented in some fuller form in a publication. And I also agree that several generations before Montesquieu and Rousseau, natural law, and especially the social contract, the idea of a social contract formed a platform, as Stefan said, of legal and political theory in Polish and Lithuanian discourse, which I think can be best illustrated by the Act of Warsaw Confederation of 1573, which sets up the rules of the elective monarchy, which really is like a social contract. Okay, so these are my short comments for excellent Stefan's lecture. Now, just a few things referring to Barbara's talk. So it is, well, Barbara is interested in how the early modern writers of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth redefined the very idea of philosophical discourse, questioning its value, autonomy, and position within other public and literary discourses of that time, while also demonstrating an awareness of its limits and shortcomings. So I think the focus here is the popularization of a philosophical protreptic discourse in the literature written in the early modern Commonwealth. So she highlights the great variety and richness of the genre, forms, and modes of philosophical discourse in Poland, which I find fascinating, focusing on the elements taken from the very protreptic tradition, but also displaying its popularity and persuasive utility on the Polish and Polish-Lithuanian ground. So what I find the most interesting and worth exploring is the connection between, as Barbara calls it, the polymorphism of philosophical literature and the multicultural realities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Some of the works are mentioned in this context. Actually, quite a few works are mentioned in this context, in this very rich introduction, I guess. But we do not learn much about how these works illustrate this connection, their content and their rhetorical function or protreptic function for that matter is not really discussed. So we learn that there is this intertextuality, but for this we need at least some citations with commentary. So I would expect that a body of literature which is contextualized will be presented through the prism of its protreptic function, or in other words, that this protreptic aspect of these works is proved and illustrated. And I think this was very much done in the last slide that we saw with Adam Gosławski. So I would really wish more attention. I wish that more attention was given to such examples, and perhaps this exactly is the plan. I don't know. Okay, so this is all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask the second speaker, who is Professor Gábor Gángor, who is a historian of philosophy with a focus of the intellectual history and the history of political ideas in East Central Europe in the 17th to 20th century. He worked at various universities in Europe, such as the University of Vienna, at the University of Miskolc and Peter Pázmány Catholic University in Budapest, as well as the University of Padua. Currently, he is affiliated with the Institute of Philosophy at the Research Center for Humanities of the Hungarian Research Network in Budapest, and the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies of the University of Erfurt. His research interest is early modern intellectual history, encompasses the life and works of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz with a special focus on his political theory and activities regarding Eastern Europe. His collaboration with the Mainz minister, late humanist scholar and science organizer Johann Christian von Boynenburg, as well as Boynenburg's contribution to the early development of modern natural law tradition in Germany. Gábor Gángor's latest edited book, published with Brill in 2023, is entitled Early Modern Natural Law in East Central Europe. Gábor, please give us your opinion.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. The intellectual power of the humanities at the University of Krakow has been facilitated by a centuries-long, uninterrupted tradition of academic teaching and research, by exceptionally rich collections of printed and manuscript sources in the city's archives and libraries for the intellectual history of late medieval and early modern Poland, Lithuania, and finally, by an outstandingly successful interpretive tradition characterized by philological skills, methodological awareness, and the due consideration of Poland's East Central European context. It is also characterized, last but not least, by deep reservations against any teleological interpretation of Polish history as a bumpy but eventually triumphant road towards from a national and religious point of view, monolithic Polish state. Both protagonists of the present session, Stefan Huber with his lecture, The Rule of Law in the Philosophical Discourse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after 1569, and Barbara Kaszowska-Wander and her presentation, Early Modern Protreptic Discourse in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, display all the strong sides of the, if I may say so, Krakow School of Early Modern Intellectual History. Both papers formulate an intriguing research program rather than summarize publication-ready research outcome. These projects open new vistas for comprehensive and multidisciplinary historical investigation, including philological basic research, digitalization, and interpretive work. Needless to say that both initiatives deserve serious consideration and close attention. We have heard two brilliant lectures on intellectual history by a philosopher and a scholar of early modern literature, respectively. This fact shows that even in Krakow, in a city which witnessed so many miracles in history, it seems impossible to make another small wonder by emancipating intellectual history as an academic discipline. Philosophers, not intellectual historians by profession, deal with texts which are not genuinely philosophical. These primary sources belong to mixed genres regarding the subject, scope, and methodology, while their concern is, above all, politics rather than metaphysics. Literary scholars, in turn, deal with literary texts which are, again, not genuinely literary. The hybrid forms of these writings primarily convey, as a rule, ethical or political messages. This Babylonian captivity of intellectual historians in the guilds of the philosophers or literary scholars, but not in that of the historians, is far from being a unique Polish phenomenon. 35 years after the democratic changes in the East Central European region, it seems definitive that intellectual history, unlike natural law in the 17th century Europe, has not been able to obtain chairs at East Central European universities. This lamentable situation is a result not only of the jealousy and the opposition by established humanistic disciplines against the newcomer rival. It has, in my view, more profound reasons. The pariah status of intellectual history indicates that East Central European countries after 1989, unlike the West after the 30 Years' War, was not in need of a new theory of political legitimation. East Central European countries were perfectly content with revitalizing some crucial elements of their political culture prior to 1945, or with or without a democratic facelift. National political traditions in this region seem to be a treasury too valuable to be ceded to the mercy of intellectual historians and their discomforting questions challenging venerable, well-established collective beliefs and urging for substantial revisions in the fabric of national historical narratives. Exactly, this revision is what the protagonists of this session have done with regard to the 16th, 17th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Both of them have intended to put into relief pluralistic tendencies in Polish-Lithuanian political and philosophical thought in terms of its cultural, confessional, linguistic varieties, as well as polyphonies of rhetoric and literary discourses. Their approach proved pluralistic also in the sense that they have formulated their research questions regarding a non-monolithic political entity, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This decision has excluded any approach based on a linguistic or religious exclusivity whatsoever. Stefan Huber aimed at rediscovering or re-identifying essential parts of the genetic code of Polish-Lithuanian political culture in the Renaissance period, a period which had, in his opinion, been pushed into the background by the great narrative of Polish history that had managed to overarch and teleologically connect all the, I quote, dramatic experiences, end of quote, of the nation from the first partition of Poland to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In line with interpretation and research recent international scholarship, above all in the authoritative works of Robert Frost, Stefan Huber argues for the following evaluation of the basic character of the Polish-Lithuanian composite state. We have heard this, I just skip the quotes. Another underlying thesis of this approach to Renaissance political culture in the Commonwealth is the absence of the conscience, let alone discourse, of backwardness in Polish-Lithuanian political thought vis-à-vis Western intellectual trends. As Stefan Huber claims, they follow their own rhythm, etc. The prosopographical studies in the second part of his paper are developed against this theoretical background. As Stefan Huber is one of the most renowned experts on these prominent figures. The synthesis of his previous publications on Andrzej Frycz-Modrzewski, Aaron Alexander Olizarowski, Paulus Vladimiri, and others in this project will promise great benefits for future research. The only aspect of Stefan Huber's paper which I had provided with a question mark after my reading is his decision to shift the context of Polish-Lithuanian political thought towards the East. This vision is suggested by the opening and the closing sentence of his subchapter titled Overview of Political Philosophy in the Renaissance Period. According to them, the Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Belarusian nations had found a common homeland in the only common modern Commonwealth. I have doubts because, first, this interpretation of the ethnic conditions of the only modern Rzeczpospolita seems to try to project the recent geopolitical interest of Poland back onto an early modern subject. This proposition might suggest a perhaps overstretched interpretation according to which the Ukrainians, while defending their country against Russia, defend at the same time this genuine, regional, supranational, cultural, and intellectual identity, and in the case of their success on the battlefield, their reward will comprise the revitalization of this regional cultural framework as well. Second, I wonder whether it is possible to exclude the Commonwealth intellectual affinities with and connections to neighboring nations and cultures in the West and the South so completely from a comprehensive re-evaluation of 16th, 17th centuries Polish-Lithuanian political thought. The plurality of rhetorical forms as a vehicle of philosophical contents, above all those of moral philosophy, constitutes the subject of Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor's paper. The principal claim of her lecture and of the research project announced by her lecture is as follows: a great variety of literary genres, rather than strictly speaking, professional philosophical treatises or commentaries contributed principally to the communication of philosophical contents in Renaissance Poland and Lithuania. The concept of protreptic discourse had been adopted to form the leading thread across a great variety of unpublished, forgotten, marginalized, or underexplored literary sources that make all the textual basis of the research. According to Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor's research hypothesis, the principal common feature of this philosophically relevant and philosophically loaded text is their morally or politically instructive pedagogical character. There are good reasons to argue that the core and final objective of every philosophical system is its ethical teaching, politics inclusiva, that is, a philosophical self-understanding within the social political reality of the philosophizing subject. The planned research should show us that in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, like in other cultures of the East Central European region, where the genuine scholastic tradition and the systematic philosophical research connected to this tradition has proven notoriously weak, philosophy was present in various humanist and Renaissance genres that offered a classic humanist ethical political teaching adapted to the reality of the social and political community. Hence, the importance of the sociability and rationality as exposed in Stoic, Ciceronian, and Thomistic traditions for Polish and Lithuanian moral and political discourse. The principles of human sociability and rationality make all the foundations of an, I quote, optimistic anthropology and of quote, prevailing in Polish legal and political discourse. From this perspective, the emphasis on the protractic character of these literary texts seem quite plausible. In the East Central European region, philosophy usually took the shape of an applied social science. The greatest merit of Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor's project is, in my view, to document that this particular role and function philosophy fulfilled in East Central Europe is characteristic not only to the period from the mid-17th century, that is after the breakthrough of modern science and philosophy in Western Europe, but also into the Renaissance period. Therefore, the author's aim is to shift these literary texts from their current marginal position within the philosophical discourse. To do this, she outlines two intertwined, overlapping, but basically distinct agendas. First, there is a broader project which is only indicated by the author, a project which would profoundly challenge the current self-understanding of Polish-Lithuanian political discourse by pointing out its genuinely polyphonic character. This group of sources contain manuscript texts belonging to religious and ethnic minority groups in Poland, Lithuania, written partly in non-Latin and non-Cyrillic, but Arabic, Armenian, or Hebrew alphabet. The status of these texts in the terminology of the Erfurt-based intellectual historian Martin Muzzo, Knowledge Lost, A New View of Early Modern Intellectual History, is not only marginal, but also precarious. That is, their marginalization is due above all to the vulnerability of their material existence, the scarcity of their copies, the inaccessibility to their science system, even for a non-specialist scholar, puts them under the constant threat of disappearance. Therefore, this group of sources poses special challenges to the research. Second, the bulk of Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor's paper deals with sources the existence of which is not precarious at all, quite the opposite. Books such as Wawrzyniec Korwin's Dialogus de Mentis Saluberiba Persuasione or Johannes Dantiscus De Virtutis et Fortunae Differentia Somnium not only exist in printed form, but also are available online in the database Krakow Online Library. Barbara Kaszowska-Wandor's aim regarding the second group of sources is to offer a different approach to texts, which do appear time and again on the radar of scholars of only modern Polish literature. Her preliminary survey of the sources indicates the possible outcomes of the research. For example, a more precise identification of the affinities between the East texts and the sources, classical or humanist. In particular, showing that Dantescu's work was originally inspired by Galen's Adhortatio ad artes addicendas rather than by the works of Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, or in general, proving that Lucretius' influence was stronger in Poland than hitherto assumed. In other words, the research shall extend the scope of investigation regarding protractic intertextuality far beyond the obvious and widely documented impact of Cicero's major works of moral philosophy on early modern Polish philosophical discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabor. And we are passing quickly to the third respondent, which is Tomasz Nejewska, who is a professor of philosophy at the Palacki University in Olomouc. He directs the Department of Philosophy and the Center for Renaissance Texts at the Faculty of Arts of the Palacki University. Professor Nejewska research interests focus on medieval philosophy. He resounds Bonaventure together with early Franciscan school and St. Bernard of Clairvaux, but mainly on the philosophy of Renaissance. Main authors he studies are Francesco Petrarca, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Pietro Pomponazzi, Gasparo Contarini, Tommaso Campanella, and Francis Bacon. He is interested also in the reception of Renaissance philosophy in the Czech lands. He edited all Czech translations of Marsilio Ficino's letters, the spiritual writings of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, as well as works of Joannes Jensenius and Joannes Amos Comenius. His latest publications are the edition with Old Czech and his own translations of Marsilio Ficino, De Officiis, and Veritas de Institutione Principis, and also a chapter on Pietro Pomponazzi in Paul Bloom and James Snyder's Renaissance Philosophy and Anthology, edited in Washington, D.C. And an article, Il Rinascimento veneziano nell'Europa centrale, Aristotelismo e Platonismo nell'opera di Joannes Jensenius, laureato dell'Università di Padova. Tomasz, be so kind to present your comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I would like to start by saying that I'm honored to be a respondent to talks we heard some minutes ago. When I was asked to do so, I must say that I was somewhat hesitant to take it on. I wondered, what do I really know about philosophy and political philosophy in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? However, when Stefan Huber wrote me that I could approach the contribution from the perspective of my own research, I decided to accept the offer. In the context of my own research, so I will not summarize these the talks, but I will make some remarks from the context of from the perspective of my own research. So in the context of my own research and scholarly interests, assessing the talks is a challenge for two reasons. Firstly, I'm well aware that as a Czech, I may view my neighbors and their history through many stereotypes that may be ingrained in my mind and have been inculcated in history classes or through narratives and popular culture. It is therefore an opportunity to uncover these stereotypes or to become aware of them and to take a critical distance. In this context, I found very stimulating that the contributions were made by researchers from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Indeed, as I was taught, it was the Krakow School of Historiography in the 19th century that, following the Enlightenment image of Poland, promoted a critical view of the role of the noble elites in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. On the one hand, It fought against the stereotypical view of Poland as a victim of malevolent neighbors. On the other hand, it contributed to the creation of another stereotype, namely the image of egoistic, noble anarchy within a dysfunctional republic. And I realized that that was the interpretation, that in this latter interpretation was prevailing one during my university studies in 1990s. And it also influenced the Czech view of political events in contemporary Poland. Of course, I did not expect from the contributions of my Krakow colleagues, which have just been made, a prolongation of the methodology of the 19th century Krakow school. Rather, they highly erudite contributions, so different from the vulgar view of Polish history in the Czech Republic, made me realize the vitality of stereotypes in the view of Polish history in contemporary Czech culture and political discourse. The second moment for which the contributions of Stefan Huber and Barbara Kaszowska-Wander became a challenge for me lies in the topic itself, in the political philosophy in the 16th and the 17th centuries. If we compare political philosophy in the Czech lens in the period in question with the political philosophical discourse in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we find a quite marked difference. This can also be demonstrated by literature available on the subject in Czech Republic. In the History of Political Thought series, I have it here somewhere, in the volume devoted to early modern political thought, there are two chapters focusing on Czech political thought, both in the context of Czech Reformation. One deals with Johannes Jesenius, incidentally a native of Wrocław. The other with Johannes Amos Comenius, who spent most of his life as an exile outside the Czech lands, partly in Poland. That's all. By the way, the publication contains nothing about political and philosophical thinking in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. On the other hand, if one is looking for publications devoted to political philosophical thinking in the Czech lands in the 16th and 17th century, one will find only a rather slim book, chapters from the history of political philosophy in the Czech lands in the 17th century by Kateřina Šolcová and Stanislav Sousedík. And here again, the main figures are Johannes Jesenius and Johannes Amos Comenius. The book and journal production devoted to political philosophy of the 16th and 17th century in the Czech lands contrasts so sharply with what is written about the political thought of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even in the Czech Republic. Just compare the book of Šolcová with these two huge books written by Czech historian Jan Květina, the first entitled The Noble Democracy, Parliamentarianism in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 16th and 17th century, and the second called The Myth of a Republic, Identity and Political Discourse of Early Modern Polish Nobility. This may indicate a different degree of importance of political philosophical thinking in the Czech lands and in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the period in question, and to the fact that this difference is surprisingly perceived in the Czech Republic as well. Now I will turn to the contributions that were made a moment ago and allow myself to add a few remarks on the basis of a comparison with the political philosophical thought in the Czech lands in the period in question, which I have partly addressed. I turn first to the contribution of Barbara Kaszowska-Wander. I very much appreciate her focus on texts of a protreptic nature. The emphasis on protreptic literature suggests a focus on texts with a practical moral direction. Barbara Kaszowska-Wander identifies their sources, which she sees in Platonic, Ciceronian, protreptic philosophical diatribes, in the intense reception of Erasmus of Rotterdam's writings, and in the philosophical didactic poetry of Gregory of Nazianzus. I was very interested in the note on the protreptic dialogues that refer to Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, specifically through the works of Marsilio Ficino. This is a topic of particular interest to me. Specifically, what Ficinian literature has been received here. As already mentioned, I have been concerned with the reception of Marsilio Ficino's works in the Czech lands, specifically the translation of Ficino's letters in the into Old Czech. It turns out that the interest of Czech humanists in the 16th century was primarily moral, philosophical. It was not Ficino's metaphysics, natural philosophy, astrology, magic, but letters with moral philosophical content corresponding to Ciceronian theme of duties or the Erasmian mirror for prince. How was it in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Can we see any parallel there? I can hardly add anything to Stefan Huber's contribution. His careful analysis of political philosophical thinking is excellent. Stefan Huber identifies as the most significant aspect the position of the laws as a key feature of a republic in which the laws are above the monarch. From the perspective of my own research on philosophy in the Czech lands, this is again a very interesting moment. In the Czech lands in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Tyrannomachist treatise Pro Vindicis contra Tyrannos by Johannes Jessenius emerges as one of the most interesting moments in the not very developed political philosophical thinking. I think it was the only interesting work written in that period in the Czech lands. It was very much inspired by Calvinist, Moralomachist, and Tyrannomachist theories and was valid to some extent as a theoretical background for the uprising of the Bohemian states against the Habsburgs. The question of the influence of this movement of Calvinist political thought, I mean the Moralomachy or Tyrannomachy, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth naturally arises. Could a similar motive be found, at least in the Calvinist theologian Andreas Volanus? Could it be here that the principle of supremacy of the law over the monarch was derived? That was my question. Finally, I would like to thank again for the opportunity to participate in this meeting and for the inspiring texts. And I wish both referees the best luck in their future research.
Thank you very much, Tomasz, and thank you very much to all respondents. It's quite late, but I think that we can find yes, a few minutes for answers, or maybe also for questions from the room. I don't know if there are some questions. There were questions answered by Oleg Zhukov on chat, but he disappeared meanwhile. So I think that it will be nice to answer him by email. So yes. Okay, so are there any other questions? No. Okay. So could you please answer briefly or summarize the... Just maybe you were the first speaker, so we can start.
Thank you very much for all these observations and remarks, and also new horizons. I think there has been a lot of remarks that are very inspiring just for future research. Just I will try to go through it as it was said. Dorota said that the gold standards of the West have been a bit problematic, and I agree. So this was just a trial to make a point, so to say. This is not referred to concepts. to the concepts of republic, of law, and so on. They all have been present in Poland. There has been a very close exchange. I think if we look at this, at these sources, they tell us a history of very close interactions with Western Europe, West Central Europe, so the German-speaking world, also the English-speaking world, and especially Italy and Switzerland. I referred this remark to chronology only. So we have different chronology in Poland, and I think this can be explained. For example, if we look at the very beginning of political thought, at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries, for example, in Paulus Vladimir, who represented the Polish-Lithuanian new thing, so it was not clear, is this a state, is it a federation, so what is it? To the European public at the Council of Constance. And this was a context in which the Lithuanians still were pagans and became Christians, but many Europeans just did not believe them, as they used their pagan identity to switch forth and back between Western and Eastern Christendom and provide their own politics by using this different religious identity. So the question that rose there was, can you be a trustworthy partner in the contract? Can you be something like a state on the European stage if you are not acknowledged as a Christian, or if you're a Christian for a short time? And so if you are the other, the barbarian in a way. And these questions have been discussed at that time very precisely and solidly, and with close regard to the Padua school of Roman law and so on. This is a very European context. So the interesting thing is that about 100 years later, a very similar discourse appears in Salamanca when the New World was discovered, and these problems appear with those who are called Indians. Are they human beings? Are they rational beings? Can they be partners? Can they be authors of something like a state? And so on. So there's different chronology in this. And a second example would be that of political thought and legal thought right in the middle of the 17th century in Poland. So authors like Soxo, Olizalowski, and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, natural law by Pufendorf, and so on. So it's clear that Hobbes is thinking after the civil wars in England. The conception of the thought of Pufendorf, or the school of natural law of Pufendorf, arises after the Peace of Westphalia. And in Poland, the critical point that made people think in a new way was not in the middle of the 17th century, but in the beginning of the 18th century, in the Great Northern War and the great crisis of the Polish and the Lithuanian state. And then we have Leszczyński and Konarski and those who are really opening up to a new thinking. And I think this was my point. So it's about chronology. You asked for approaches which would speak of higher sources of law that would be, as I understand, apodictic for positive law. And I think we can find this kind of thought. For example, in Orechovius, who provides a metaphysics of politics that allows to think in such a manner. And we have a lot of material in this style in the Sarmatian tradition. So actually their point of view is that God himself has created the world, and right after that he put the best values into the hearts of our great ancestors, And that is actually the customary law we have today, and that we need to defend against any other influences. And this is seen as a kind of ontology of higher law, higher sources of law. And of course, looking at our sources, we have to ask how divine or natural law has to be understood. So there are different ways of understanding a structure in which divine law is the highest law. What does that mean? Sometimes it's administrated by the clergy, for example. And then we can even speak of a theocratic structure. But very often this is understood in a rationalist manner. And it is clearly said that every rational being can understand this and use this kind of law. So these are very different perspectives. And also in Jesuit thought, this kind of Christian Ciceronianism, also sometimes it's very Platonic and very apodictic, and sometimes it's even naturalist. So there are different approaches in this. Then you said that the Sejm is not a parliament, and I'm very grateful for this remark. I absolutely agree. So this is an assembly, and this is clearly a difference, and this should be made clear. Yes, the Republic as based on the people. Well, maybe this is a question of wording. It's the populus. And of course, it's not just the people as all those inhabitants. Generally, it's those who are citizens. Of course, this is one of the critical points in the discourse. Who is a citizen? And we have very different approaches. A lot of philosophers are very critical about the noble approach to this question. So they propose to widen this concept of civis. Both Dorota and Gabor spoke about the lack of intellectual history as a kind of school in thinking about the history of philosophy in our region. I agree. I couldn't say more, just agree. As for the backwardness mentioned by Gabor, well, I mentioned the problem of chronology. I think this has been answered. We have this kind of problem with philosophers who are presented in very popular synoptic presentations of history of philosophy in Poland and Lithuania, for example, by Pleczkaitis and so on. And they sometimes speak of precursor, so if something was earlier, and then they speak of backwardness. So this is right the problem we have with this chronology, and which I am trying to solve just by changing the perspectives. As for the Eastern orientation, yes, this is true. I'm working on this project from 2016, more or less, and this has left some traces, so that's true. I'm absolutely not proposing something like a Jagiellonian myth or some vision of community of nations between, let's say, the German and the Russian world, that have some common approach to law and statehood and so on. On the contrary, when we look at the sources, we find so many conflicts between, on the one hand, the Orthodox Eastern Christians, the Unions, especially after the Union of Brest, and all their complaints about the injustice they are exposed to in the Commonwealth are related to some theories of justice. Also, very often in academic courses, we find an explication of what justice is, and this is clearly referred to the experience, for example, of an Orthodox or Union Christian who lives on the territories of, let's say, Western Ukraine today, and they just complain that they are not citizens and they are not accepted, and their bishops are not members of the Senate and so on. So this is not about common solutions, it's about common problems that turned into civil wars as well. So this has to be underlined, I think. Tomasz, yeah, just we must yes. So just one short remark to Thomas. I think we could have a discussion on that by email. You asked it for Ficino and Platonism in Poland. I think this is a huge problem. We have no history of Platonism and of Ficino in Poland, but we find texts which are Platonic. Again, Orychowius is extremely Platonic, Neoplatonic. It's Proclus in its purest form in a way, yeah, but it's presented as Aristotelianism. So we find in the history of philosophy in Poland and Lithuania that Orychowius was an Aristotelian. He was completely a Proclusian Neoplatonic author. And so I just completely agree. This is an important topic. Thank you so much. And sorry for talking.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have any more time for Barbara, or we should conclude and finish. Yes. So thank you very much for this absolutely fascinating discussion and papers. Thank you very much, all the respondents and all the guests. I think that this discussion could be continued in emails, yes, because it is important to connect and to know people, and then we can correspond. Okay, so thank you very much again. Thank you, FISIER, for inviting us to contribute to the session. And again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être au nom de la FISIER, je voulais à mon tour aussi remercier d'abord Gratina pour l'organisation et les intervenants et intervenantes. Merci pour ces présentations, pour la découverte et la redécouverte pour certains, qui nous ont offert énormément qui nous ont montré en fait des situations avec les textes, donc les acteurs, les lieux, les contextes. Merci pour les dialogues entre différentes approches, et on a vu apparaître des enjeux communs, donc notamment la culture politique et ses paradoxes aussi, les conditions d'une réflexion juridique, politique, philosophique. Merci pour la rencontre entre disciplines aussi, qui a mis en lumière certains enjeux importants, enjeux d'ailleurs où la rhétorique est reine, hein, et où l'éthique aussi est reine, et ça va de pair, on le sait bien, on a parlé de Cicéron entre autres. Et merci enfin pour les points de rencontre avec des situations qui intéressent une part d'entre nous aussi plus à l'ouest. C'est très instructif pour les échos, les résonances qu'on peut avoir, et bref, une belle occasion.
I won't translate everything that Pascal just said, but I just want to thank everyone in the room and all of the discussants, and also the public, which was both virtual and in presence, and just to point out the interdisciplinary and the sort of heuristic part of this seminar, that we just discovered so many things, and we learned about so many things, at least from my point of view and from much of the public's point of view, and everything was so clearly presented that I'm really very thankful to all of you. I should also emphasize what Gratina just said, that I hope that email exchanges will ensue, and that we can work on what we've just done in the seminar in the future, and find other occasions to collaborate. And with that, I want to thank Gratina once again, and we will see you soon, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you.